Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. This episode is brought to you by LMNT Electrolytes. This month, we're switching it up with an exclusive offer that's only for VIP LMNT partners, including Carnivore Cast listeners. You can now receive this free sample pack along with any regular purchase when you use my custom link, which is provided in the show notes or my Instagram link in bio. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, all one word. And as I said, I'll include the link in the show notes. LMNT Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious. And get yours today to help support the show. Thank you. James Leman at _carnivorous is a 50-year-old who is born, lives, and works in the beautiful island of Bermuda with his wife, Gabby. James is here today to share with us his journey from being vegetarian for decades to strict plant-based vegan for 5 years, most recently as an animal-based carnivore. He's endured multiple hospitalizations, autoimmune issues, anxiety, depression, and many other health problems before coming to this way of eating. Welcome to the show, James.
Scott, what an absolute honor it is to be talking to you today, man. I've been really looking forward to this. I mentioned quickly before we started recording, but Carnivore Cast for me was one of the things that really helped me during my journey. I would describe you and your show as a light in a very dark tunnel in my beginning stages. So thanks again for all that you've done.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored. And I'm really grateful for people like you making the show possible. Both listeners and guests. So thank you so much.
Sure.
I'll start with a little bit of a fun question before we get into your background. How did you end up in Bermuda?
I was actually born and raised here. My mom is Bermudian by birth. My dad is Canadian. So they met when they were very young, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's a beautiful place to be from and to grow up, albeit very expensive on an island to live because we have to import everything.
Yeah, it's crazy, the economics of islands sometimes. I remember even when I went to Iceland, some of the vegetables were extraordinarily expensive. And it makes sense. They have to import everything. And especially when it's a smaller place, we import a lot of this stuff in the US, but there's global supply chains built around it. I think it's a lot different with an island.
Yeah, we're 21 miles long and 1 mile wide at our widest point. And there's 60,000 people here, as I said on another show, clinging to a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We're lucky, Scott, in that we have arable land that's protected by the government here. So we have some farming, and we have a couple of small dairy farms and a couple of small hen farms for fresh eggs. But other than that, yeah, it's very small. We have to import everything. I mean, international business and tourism are two main pillars here of industry.
Yeah, makes sense. And so tell me about your story. How did you get to where you are today? Walk us through your health journey, the long version, please.
Sure. So, coming from Bermuda, I grew up, I'm now, as you mentioned in the intro, I'm 50 years old. I was born in 1972. I had a very great upbringing here. I had my schooling, young age here in Bermuda. We ate pretty much a sort of a standard American diet. And as you probably know, and the food pyramid and the American U.S. guidelines, the Bermuda would follow it very closely. So 1972, and especially as I got older, when the guidelines were released in 77, George McGovern and all that fun stuff, my parents and maybe your parents as well changed their eating habits a little. I mean, my mom was, and still continues to be, a vegetarian. She doesn't eat any meat at all, albeit she does eat eggs and some dairy products. And, we ate some meat because my father did, but primarily we ate a lot of vegetarian pasta dishes, rice, and I can't believe it's not butter, which I still can't believe it's not butter. And Pop-Tarts.
Had a lot of that growing up.
Oh yeah, Pop-Tarts and cereals, Kellogg's cereals when I was younger. I ended up going off to boarding school in Canada because, as I mentioned, my dad's Canadian. So the fees for tuition were a lot less expensive. And when I was away in school, I got into sports quite heavily. I did crew, I think, as you did. So we share that interest.
Yeah.
8 years.
Yeah, man. I did a few years. We ended up winning the Ontario Championships in the eight. I was the number 7 in the 8
Oh,
boat.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
Canada is very serious about their rowing.
yeah. It was a phenomenal time for me because I ended up eating a lot differently as well, and I'll come back to that a little later. But going to boarding school and just you basically have to eat what they give you in the food hall, and it was a lot of meat at the time, and I thrived. I played basketball, did crew. Later on, after university, I stayed for my university career in Canada. I met a young lady, and I'm going back now to the early 90s. And she, at the time, was also vegetarian, which was pretty admirable of her because at that time, there wasn't a lot of vegetarian stuff out there, really. I mean, there was some, but it wasn't very, very widely utilized by a lot of people. And I ended up switching my diet because it was just easier. We were dating at the time and living together. And I just went full vegetarian for a while. And what I should have noticed is that, my health started to change a little bit at that time. Of course, you don't, you just said, oh, yeah, I got sick and whatever. Didn't feel well. But um, from there, I came back to Bermuda after my university career. I ended up adding back in some fish, so I was more pescatarian for a while, and but stayed in that sort of pescatarian, vegetarian state for decades afterwards. And what happened is that I think progressively, and I think fish and the eggs held me for a while, but I started to notice things changing in terms of my health. I had a couple of episodes where I fainted and gave myself concussions. My blood pressure was really low. I just was putting on a lot of weight, which I hadn't done when I was very physically active. I mean, when you come out of university and you're in your working career, as you know, it can get pretty hectic, but I had always enjoyed a pretty active physical life. And I ended up, you know, being quite sickly for a while. I just didn't look or feel well. I ended up meeting my wife, and we basically she adhered as I did in the past to my diet a little bit, and found out that she's from Venezuela originally, where they ate a lot of meat, and she found out that going away for her helped her a little bit, and she started looking further into going completely vegan, and that was sort of the start or beginning of the end in terms of how bad my health was going to become, and I'll get into that a little bit. But essentially, we fell hook, line, and sinker for all the sort of propaganda-based films, as many people did. You know, Game Changers, Forks Over Knives, Cowspiracy, things of that nature. We watched those and we thought, all right, we only have a few more animal foods in our diet. We can eliminate those. We're going to feel healthier. Our mindset was we're going to be doing better for the planet, and our health should be, according to these films, should be fantastic after this. And I'm going to pause right after this, Scott, to give you a chance to speak. But I will tell you in an honest moment, for a while it was. My health did get better, for sure.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think it got better?
I think that as a vegetarian, pescatarian, I had incorporated a lot of processed foods, a lot of seed oil laden stuff, a lot of convenient microwave meals. Back in the day, I was, fresh in the working world in the insurance industry back then. There was a lot of partying, and you get some money when you're younger and you hang out with your buds on a Friday evening. But I also had increased my drinking at the time, which wasn't a good thing. And I think when you go vegan and you change your diet, there's that sort of ideology that you're going to do better by yourself all around, not only in terms of your diet but your health. I started exercising again, and I felt better. And I think it's primarily from eliminating a lot of those toxic foods, the processed stuff that I had eaten in the past.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and thanks for sharing your story as well. It's incredible how long you endured it. But yeah, I think that's a big reason, that one of many reasons, some of which you also noted, like the documentaries and the sort of pop culture and virtue signaling, are common reasons that veganism persists. But I think another is just that initial feeling is enough to hook you. People are addicted to immediate results. And if you can do vegan for 30 days and you're otherwise eating a bunch of processed food, like you are probably going to feel better, especially if you change other lifestyle habits around it and you become part of this community. You're like, oh, I'm part of something now. All of that plays into it. It's really interesting. This episode is brought to you by Optimal Carnivore. Many people I talk to struggle to get enough organ meat on a carnivore diet. There's debate about whether you need to eat organs or not, but I like to supplement with organ meats and it makes me feel better, and many carnivores would agree. Optimal Carnivore was created by carnivores for carnivores. In fact, I was consulted during the formulation, which is pretty cool. They have a unique organ complex that combines 9 different organs, liver, brain, heart, and more, all from grass-fed, grass-finished animals in New Zealand. And taking 6 capsules a day is the same as eating an ounce of raw liver. And it's completely freeze-dried, and they use a very high-quality process to retain all the nutrients. You can use the link in the episode description or the link in my Instagram bio and use the code Carnivore10 to save at checkout and support the show. Thank you.
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. I think for the first couple of years, we sort of thrived. And I've mentioned before, but my wife actually got certified as a plant-based chef and still has that certification. And, a lot of that, looking back now, Scott, is that when I became and added animal foods back into my diet, was that, you clearly weren't doing the vegan diet right to have to do that. Now, I get that a lot now because I'm quite open and honest about my journey. So people know that I was a vegetarian, pescatarian to vegan, and now mostly animal-based carnivore. And they say, you must not have been doing it correctly. And I tell people, I can pretty much assure you, we were doing it really, really well. We were eating whole foods, plant-based. I basically had restaurant quality dishes for every meal from my wife. I mean, it was unbelievable. I look back at some of the pictures that she had to take for her to get her certification, and they were like Michelin star dishes I was getting. But little did I know at the time that it was just ripping my insides to shreds. And as I say, by that second or third year, I started to notice some things changing.
Yeah. And how did it progress from there?
It started with the brain fog. I remember sitting at my job one day and going, I can't remember what I was planning to do here. And that was unlike me. I was like, how did I get here? And it's just the brain fog was unrelenting for a while. And I felt really sick and had gone to the doctors because I was getting sort of very cold in my extremities. I recall even sitting there and just in the middle of summer wrapped up in almost a parka because I was shivering all the time. We had tested, I had gone into sort of Hashimoto's type symptoms. My skin and nails started just drying out. My hair was falling out. But the real thing that came for me was the severe constipation. It was just awful. I couldn't figure out, because of all the fiber I was packing in my diet, what was going on. How could this be happening? And with the constipation, then came blood in my stools, which really, really got me nervous. That scared the life out of me for sure.
Yeah, that's incredibly frightening. And what did you do? Like, what were you still like, I have to be doing something right? Or like, what was going through your head at that point?
It's a great question, Scott. And that's it. I thought there couldn't be any other way than the vegan diet. I mean, this was the most healthy diet you could possibly eat. We had been told this is the ultimate, where our bodies should be absorbing all this stuff, I never thought it could be the diet. So what did I do? I delved down even further at like the stubborn male that I am, and said, I'm going to go even harder at this. And I found this doctor online who allegedly had cured her autoimmune issues with these smoothies. And these smoothies included 2 bags of kale, a bag of spinach, chia seeds, and kiwi fruit, all blended up, and use that for 3 meals of your day. And I drank those every day, 3 meals straight. And it made things so incredibly worse. The bleeding increased, my bloating and gas increased. And no matter what I did, Scott, even after I started adding other foods back in, I couldn't stop losing weight. I ended up being 128 pounds at 6'2" and bedridden with fatigue. And I couldn't get out of bed. I ended up losing my job when the pandemic hit. This was all happening around the pandemic, and in some ways, it was a blessing because I couldn't have even worked in an honest moment with you, Scott. I couldn't have. I was
Wow.
just really, really in bad shape.
That's so scary. And what was your wife thinking?
She was terrified for me and wondering what was going on. I became severely depressed. My anxiety was through the roof. As you can imagine, not only was I scared for myself, but I was scared for my family who was watching this, looking like a scarecrow as I did at the time, and trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And with losing my job, I lost my insurance. So I was scared if I end up being hospitalized, which I had been a few times before, with the bleeding out of the bowels. We were trying to test to see if I had severe ulcerative colitis from my GP. But of course, when COVID hit, they shut down the small hospital we have here to make way for patients and stopped elective surgery. So I couldn't do it anyhow. And then I lost the insurance and I couldn't afford to do it. So I had to figure all this stuff out on my own.
So what happened next? Like, where'd you go from there? It sounds like you were at the bottom at this point.
I was basically bedbound and scared and not thinking straight and angry and depressed and anxious and not sleeping. I think I slept for almost a year, maybe 3 hours a night. It was, I just couldn't. I was in so much pain from my body, the fibromyalgia, the anxiety, the lack of the ability to clear the toxins from being able to go to the bathroom. I had to help in other ways, which was not fun because it would just be filled with blood after I did. So I was really scared. My wife, God bless her, was a very patient woman and stuck with me. She suggested to me to go online and listen to podcasts. I had never listened to podcasts before I got ill most recently, and that's how I ended up finding on YouTube Sally Norton in the first instance, and her presentation on YouTube called Lost Seasonality and the Overconsumption of Plants. And what that did was opened up the possibility that I could have been doing this all wrong.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
How did you end up there?
I was just typing in anything because I was like, typing in YouTube, plants, are they harmful? Can they cause these symptoms in the body? And that presentation came up and I must have watched it 3 times because I was so brain fogged. I was like, this can't, what I'm hearing can't be right. Okay. So what she's suggesting is that we have bred plants out of season and over consuming them in the grocery stores now because ancestrally we used to eat plants when they were in season and not in the quantities we are now. And I started to think to myself, man, and then I started to ask myself, okay, so what are these defense chemicals in plants and oxalates, as you know, Sally, who's an expert in? I was eating the most toxic oxalate bombs there are. I mean, when you heard what I just described in my smoothies, I forgot to mention that included 3 teaspoons of turmeric as well, which is one of the highest oxalate spices. And it was literally ripping my guts to pieces.
Wow. And where did you go from there? Did you seek out more podcasts, more information, or how did you start moving in a different direction?
This is where God bless the gentleman I'm staring right in the screen at now comes into play. I searched Sally Norton on every platform I could find. And the first one I found was your interview you did with her in 2019, Scott, on Carnivore Cast. And it was transformational for me because it reaffirmed what I learned in that first presentation. But then I went back and I listened to every single Carnivore Cast episode there ever was from the beginning. And I started to realize that maybe if I start to not only lower the oxalate foods that I was consuming, but add animal foods back into my diet, I could see a way out of it. There was a light, and you were, as I mentioned before, you were a light in my very dark tunnel at that time, my friend.
Thank you. I'm about to break down in tears. This is
me too.
crazy.
I do get a little emotional, excuse me, with this discussion because it was such an emotional journey for me because I felt alone, and having the Carnivore Cast and listening to it on a daily basis, just I can recall sitting in the bed and laying there and every day just plugging in my headphones in the morning and listening and just learning, writing down what little I could, and just going from there. And I've been asked before, was there a lot of cognitive dissonance when I came back to adding animal foods in my diet as a vegan? And I can say that yes and no. Yes, in that I still care, Scott, to this day about how animals are treated. That hasn't left me. I mean, the videos of those, that I think anyone who mistreats animals is not a very good human being. However, when you're faced with the prospect of not being around in another few months to a year, you've got to do something. The will to live for yourself, for your family, it's strong. And
Yeah.
I realized through listening to Carnivore Cast that ancestrally these are the foods that made us who we are today, and I had to add them back in.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. That's incredible, James. And how did you start? Like, what were the first steps you made, and what did you feel?
Yeah. So knowing what your listeners now know about my being from Bermuda and my past sort of dietary choices, I went the easy route for me, because literally with my autoimmune issues at the time that I was having, I had this rare thing which you can look up. It's called burning tongue syndrome, where your tongue literally feels like it's on fire because of autoimmunity, and you can't.
Wow.
It's horrible. It's one of the worst. I had a number of things, but that had to be one of the worst because I couldn't taste anything. I went for the easy stuff. I went back to fish first. We're surrounded by ocean here, and it's easy for me to get really fresh fish. And I can tell you, I recall that first day, and it was easier mentally for me too because it had been in my past dietary choices, most recent dietary past choices. And I I struggled a bit at first. I'm not going to lie, I struggled a bit at first, as did my digestion, because probably as you know, we lose the ability over time to break down a lot of the enzymatic processes. Like when I'm eating plants all the time, your stomach acid lowers as a vegan. You need to increase that stomach acid, get those digestive enzymes back. But by that, next day, I noticed my energy bouncing back a little bit. My brain fog starting to have a little glimmer of hope. And I thought, okay, I think I'm on the right track here. And I slowly began to add other foods in as my body would allow, and as my digestion would allow, I added them back in.
That's really incredible. And how how did you balance it? Like, you want to control, for being strict plant-based vegetarian for so long. You obviously, like you're saying, your body needs time to build back up these enzymatic processes. How did you, like, did you still eat plant foods, and how did you choose which plant foods to eat? Because obviously, like, now you're like, oh man, I don't want to put more of the poisonous oxalates in my system I know are harming me, but I can't eat too much meat all at once because I'm afraid it, like, my body might not be able to process it.
Fantastic question. As I mentioned, I really have to give Sally so much credit in my journey, and yourself, and others, which we'll talk about. But one other person I came across we can talk about a little bit later is Dr. Sean Baker's Rogan podcast, which was seminal for so many people switching up their diet. But I made a commitment that I was going to add back in the foods to start, the animal based foods, excuse me, and then I would continue to eat the low oxalate plant foods. So I used Sally as a resource, and all her low oxalate foods and fruits that were low oxalate. So out went the kiwi fruit, out went the raspberries and blackberries. I substituted those with blueberries and strawberries, which are lower oxalate. In terms of my greens, I was taking out the kale and the spinach and having things like butter, lettuce, avocado. I went more ketogenic in my approach for sure. And that helped me for a while.
Yeah, it's very intelligent, and I'm glad that you were able to latch on to Sally and her fantastic information on oxalates. How did your health progress with this diet, and how did you get to progressively more animal foods as well?
Sure. Yeah, it definitely started to improve. I noted things like my hair that had been falling out, coming back a little better. My nails that had been cracking. I remember looking as a vegan at the final stages, Scott, at my fingers, and they were so cracked and they would bleed nonstop. And the skin finally started to heal. What took and continues to take the longest, because I need people to understand this is an ongoing journey. When you're talking about myself here, that has literally bombed my digestive tract and body with plant foods and fiber and high oxalate laden plant foods for so many years, the journey is a long one. And Sally will tell people that it almost isn't until the 9th year of low oxalate you really start to feel the full benefits, albeit, early on you can get them. So yeah, I tread very lightly in the early stages, noticed the benefits, but it was still my digestion that was not exactly perfect.
And how did your eating evolve with that low oxalate approach?
Yeah, as I mentioned to you, I started researching because Sally, at the time was um, going into the carnivore diet herself a little bit. She made some adjustments. She's back to adding some low oxalate fruits and plants back in her diet, which we'll talk about later for myself. But I ended up finding, as I mentioned, Dr. Baker, and knowing what I knew about animal foods being the lowest source of oxalates that you can get, and the healing of various autoimmune issues like Michaela Peterson and her journey, Dr. Jordan Peterson, and countless others, yourself, on the carnivore way of eating. I said, well, I'm just gonna, really nail this down and look to go full carnivore for a while. And that I only recently started that. It's about just over 7 or 8 months ago that I had gone full carnivore with eliminating the last of those vegetables.
That's great. And how did that feel for you? How did that go, being full carnivore?
Scott, I can tell you my digestive tract had not functioned better since I went full carnivore for decades.
Wow.
And it just was such relief. The brain fog lifted. My energy came back. I was still suffering with some fatigue on the keto with plants in there, but eliminating the vegetables for me was the biggest thing. And I have not had a vegetable since in over 7 or 8 months. I continue to see improvements. I put weight back on. I'm back up to 100 and almost 70 pounds now, but it's
Wow,
mostly,
that's great.
yeah, mostly muscle. And I continue to want to put on weight. I think we've messaged each other a few times on Instagram, and thanks again for your assistance when I was really finding my way in the early stages of carnivore. So yeah, it's been going phenomenally, but there's been some nuances since then we can talk about.
Yeah, and I want to pause for a minute to draw attention to an outside perspective. How was your wife perceiving these changes, and like you going basically from one end of the spectrum to the other? What did she think of all of it?
Yeah, she was noticing unbelievably how far I'd come in a relatively short period of time, because that year or so of my severe illness and trying to figure out was so, as I said to someone else, was drawn out like a blade from Shawshank Redemption. It just seemed to go on and on, especially with the backdrop of COVID, right? When the whole world had shut down, it was even more depressing, losing my job and everything else. But the relative time for what it took for me to get over those symptoms using the carnivore way of eating was absolutely incredible. I couldn't believe how fast things actually healed once I added in all these other animal-based foods.
That's amazing. And yeah, you mentioned some nuances now, like what has changed in the last 7 or 8 months, and how are you thinking about the diet going forward?
Yeah. So many thanks to you again, Scott. I think we had a discussion on private message on Instagram once where I was struggling, and like you, and from what I understand from your journey, one of the things I've tried to nail down in mine is sleep. Sleep has always eluded me ever since I was a child. My parents even told me that sleep was a struggle for me from a young baby.
Yeah.
And yeah, and your discussions on sleep and electrolytes over the term was a really pivotal for me. I still was struggling with sleep. I was struggling a lot with the electrolyte issue and leg cramps throughout the night. I still do from time to time, but I've managed to balance those out. And lastly, what I began to realize, and again, thank you, Sally, so much for everything that she does. She really has been instrumental, and I credit her for so many things in my own journey as well, is that there's this thing called oxalate dumping. And when you go too low and you start eliminating all these plant foods all at once, your body goes, hallelujah, the bombing stopped. We're going to release all these things all at once. And the only way and let me tell you, they're no fun going in. They're even worse coming out.
Yeah.
even worse. And I had all the signs, and some of the signs your listeners should know are cloudy urine. You can see the grit in your stools, a heightened tartar on your behind your teeth, grit in the eyes. Again, your symptoms flare to the point where you think, is this coming back? What happened? But actually, no, it's the oxalates coming out. Things like fibromyalgia, pain, arthritis, things like start coming back, dumping through the skin. These are all things that you can come to expect. So the trick is to not go so low as to cause a massive dump. You have to sort of add a couple of foods that are medium oxalate back in your diet to slow the process down, or it can be extremely dangerous, in fact.
Yeah, I remember Sally talking about that extensively. So how are you adding those foods back in, and what seems to be working for you?
Sure. So I decided, and I don't think I ever will go back to eating any vegetables. They just don't do well for me, Scott. I don't intend to. But what I did add back, and thanks for your suggestions, were things like bananas. I think worked for you in the early
Yep.
days,
Yep.
and bananas are a medium to low ox fruit. They're a great source of potassium. So I was trying to combine everything in one bang that I was facing. And I think bananas were a good source of not only a little bit of carbohydrate for me, a good portion of potassium for the leg cramps, and also a good portion of oxalates to stop all those things. And they worked really well. And I also add in blueberries as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, both from the oxalate perspective as well as a metabolic perspective. Being someone who, I imagine you're like me, you're a bit of more of like a worrier type, like kind of highly active, a little bit higher anxiety. You're lean, you're tall, you live in a very tropical climate. Your body and your anthropology probably doesn't lend itself to being like zero carb all the time. And you're also probably someone who tends to very easily like lose weight, as I do. Like I've a abysmal appetite most of the time. And so I think, for those reasons, I think that little bit of fruit can also be helpful, in some of those senses. And all these things kind of tie together in different ways. And one of them is like higher stress, a little more anxiety, a little more jittery, a little worse sleep. Like all those things seem to be a recurring kind of phenotype, if you will. And I'm definitely that. It sounds like maybe you are too.
Scott, I feel like you're a brother from another mother, my friend. It is exactly how I am. I've always been a hard gainer. I know you've mentioned you are. Even when I was packing on the weight and in crew and everything, I was always a hard gainer. However, when it comes to losing weight, I will, to the dismay of so many others that are struggling to lose weight, I can lose it so quickly. That's why I think everything dropped, in addition to what was going on in my digestive tract, so quickly on the vegan diet. And yeah, it all sort of tied in. I think the whole journey to me where I am now, it was meant to happen the way it was. That I was meant to come across yourself and Sally and figure out what the heck was going on. And it continues to this day. We're on an ongoing journey, aren't we?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And James, you mentioned before you came on that like part of your goal in sharing, or I don't want to take the words out of your mouth. You talked about part of your goal in sharing your story. Do you want to talk about that now a little bit?
Yeah, I really need to get this message out there, and you've done such a fantastic job already in paving the way. We truly are, and I'm standing on your shoulders, the shoulders of giants, and we all are, from the physicians and doctors and people before us that have figured this thing out in their own very dark health journey. But everything is so individualistic and nuanced, as we've just talked about in my own journey. We need to experiment, and I need to let people know that the dogma that was pervasive for me in the vegan way of eating, and even to a degree, it's crept in. I think, Scott, you can comment on this better than I can. Even now, more so in the carnivore way of eating,
Yep.
it's really challenging because we all need to be our N of one. We need to experiment with what works for us. We see a lot of these influencers online that are doing everything quote unquote perfectly. And how dare you add in supplements to your regime? Well, here's another nuance for you. Because I was so malnourished from a vegan way of eating, I had to include supplements for me. I had to include betaine, HCl, digestive enzymes, and your co-show sponsors, Optimal Carnivore, were instrumental for me because I needed to get the extra nourishment that I hadn't gotten for years. So it's really tough. Be your own N of one. Listen to people and try things out. Figure out what works for you and what doesn't. And don't be so dogmatic that you're blinded and like me, was fumbling around trying to figure out and trying to do everything perfectly.
Yeah, that's a fantastic message. I agree with everything you said. And I think also, if you see other people doing that, encourage them and don't discourage them. I think that's a big part of it too. A lot of people are very sensitive and harbor a lot of feelings of shame or guilt, and wanting to feel included and accepted. And so if you see them, working through their own individual experiences and trying different things, like, try to be supportive of that, not try to tell them why they're wrong.
100%. And it's one of the reasons I can share with you that I'm in the process of getting my certification of becoming a carnivore coach with Dr. Baker's program in Rivera Health. I want to be able to help others for sure. I know this is why I went through what I went through. And it wasn't just these little nuances that I went down deep rabbit holes on. I mean, I listened to countless hours of physicians and other people that have been through similar experiences. So I have a lot of insights to offer, and I hope I can, because I don't want anyone ever to feel like I did, fumbling around in the dark and scared for their life. And I know there's still a lot of people out there that do.
Yeah, absolutely. And if those people are listening to this, message me, message James. We're here to help, and want to make sure that people feel supported, and you're not alone, like you said.
Yeah. And when I put a quote up on my Instagram page, and for God's sakes, whatever you do, if you're sitting on a nail, don't take an aspirin, get off the flipping nail. And it's just to say, don't keep, I was hammering with those smoothies every day. I thought, this can't be wrong. The vegan diet has to be the way it is. And I was just hammering that nail in deeper and deeper.
Yeah, I think that's part of what we have to be thankful of our wives for too. Often she's the one who tells me to get up off the nail.
Scott, I often get asked, who, I've already mentioned yourself and Sally, obviously, and then countless others. But again, I wish to thank my wife. She stuck through me through some very, very dark times. And, one of the biggest benefits for me, but besides my physical healing, has been the mental healing on the carnivore diet. I am far more calm. I am level-headed, with the brain fog gone. My disposition has come full circle now to where I was as a young boy eating those meats in boarding school, and my joy of life has come back. It's unbelievable to sense, and I wish and I hope people can experience that.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it sounds like she's very lucky to have you, and vice versa. So I'm very happy for you, James. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story today. I feel like we could talk for hours, and hopefully we will in the future. But thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed learning more about you. And I'll have a link to your Instagram account in the show notes. Is there anything else you want to share with listeners?
Oh, Scott, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you for having me today. Really thank you for your listeners for taking the time. If you've gotten to the end here with us and listening to it, thank you for following me. If you end up following me on Instagram, I plan to start a YouTube channel very soon. I'll make sure Scott gets the address for that.
Yeah,
I'm going to be doing some Instagram lives, and there is always hope. Never forget that. There is always hope. And as I mentioned before, if you just seek the knowledge, apply the knowledge, and just have an open mind, you can heal, and it's out there for you. Just go and grab it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic message. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.